Okay, I'm going to join the skeletons here. We have Mr. Skeleton Man, and we have a drawing of Mr. Skeleton Man. And we're going to introduce you to some of the major bones in the body. There's actually 206 bones in the body. And people who take anatomy learn all of those bones and usually 5 or 6 parts of every single bone. So in case, as I talk a little bit about bones today, you're thinking, oh, he covered everything I'll need to learn if I were to take a human anatomy class. No, but not at all, but I will give you a bit of an introduction. So we will give you talk a little bit about some of the more important bones. So on page B1. Now the way that I would test you on the final is I will either have some numbers on the bones, and you'll have to identify, for example, that's the sternum or the clavicle, or I may just use the picture, and there'll just be a line going to that bone, and you'll just have to write down what that bone is. So let's introduce you to some of the bones here on page V1. All right, so first, the bone on the front of your forehead this is pretty easy, called the frontal bone. That's pretty easy. The cheekbone right here is called the zygomatic bone. Zygomatic, that's the cheekbone. The upper jaw is called the maxilla, and the lower jaw is your mandible. All right, so you're thinking, well, so what are you going to ask us to know? You're going to memorize these. Yes. All right. Now, in the bone right here is the clavicle. In English, we commonly call it a collarbone, but we're not learning English, we're learning science. So it is actually one of the most commonly broken or fractured bones, because when people trip, when they fall off a bicycle, when they fall while skiing, this bone, if you feel it, the clavicle, is right under the skin. It's not very deep in the body. It's not protected by muscles, so it snaps pretty readily. On the back side, in the shoulder area, is the scapula. And the scapula, in English, is commonly called the shoulder blade. But we're not learning English. But if you feel like right back here, what you would commonly call your shoulder blade, we call the scapula. So you should know that name. All right, so we've spoken of that. Now, right here is the sternum. You might call it the breastbone in English, but we'll call it the sternum. And then we have the vertebral column, the vertebrae. And incidentally, there are discs between the vertebrae. Between the vertebrae, there are these discs. You can see how they're kind of shown here, kind of grayish. And these act kind of like shock absorbers between the vertebrae. Sometimes these discs slip out of place, or they get compressed. So there are various kinds of problems that can develop in those discs, called ruptured discs and slip discs and so on, referring to the intervertebral discs. What does the root inter mean? Anybody know? Inter? No? Inter means between. So intervertebral means between the vertebrae. Intervertebral. Between the vertebrae, there are these discs. The very bottom vertebra right here, that I've kind of just colored in blue, it's not really blue, is the sacrum. That's this really large vertebra right down here, the sacrum. Now, this area is the pelvis. And this large bone right here that makes up part of the pelvis is called the ilium. That's called the ilium. And in fact, you don't have to know this, but where the sacrum and the ilium meet, people will call that the sacroiliac joint. If you've ever heard that expression, my old sacroiliac. But anyway, you don't have to know that. Sacrum and the ilium. All right, so we've spoken of the vertebral column, the vertebrae, the intervertebral discs, the bottom vertebra, the sacrum, and the ilium. We've talked about the skull and the clavicle, the scapula, and the sternum. Okay, let's just name some of the bones of the arms. So the upper arm bone is the humerus. I don't know how funny it is, but it is called the humerus. And there are two bones in the forearm, the radius and the ulna. Let me try to give you some help as far as knowing which one's which. The radius is on the thumb side, and the ulna is on the little finger side. And a context that some of you have heard of the radius is that if you ever taken your pulse, anybody ever checked to see if you're still alive? All right, they actually call it a radial pulse. So if you were to feel, put your fingers right where you probably have felt or palpated, you'll notice you're feeling or trying to feel a pulsation in an artery right on your wrist. And can you see your feeling on the thumb side? That is actually the radial artery. It's called the radial pulse, and it's the radial artery. You can't really see it, but it's right, you can feel it down there, and it's running right next to your radial bone. So the radius is on the thumb side, and there's a radial artery. The bones become a really big deal for people who take anatomy classes, because the names that we use for the different bones become similarly the names we use for muscles and for blood vessels and for nerves. So if there's a radial bone, there's a radial artery and a radial vein and a radial nerve. And if there is an ulnar bone, there's an ulnar artery and an ulnar vein and an ulnar nerve. So we use those terms a lot. The bones of the wrist are called carpal bones. They're called carpal bones. And the context that some of you have heard, carpal, is you've seen cashiers at markets who have something called carpal tunnel syndrome. And they get a lot of pain in the wrist area from repeated motion of the wrist, being a cashier. That's called carpal tunnel syndrome. Again, I'm not asking you to know that term. I'm just trying to give you a tool to help you remember what carpal bones are. Now, there are 5 bones that form the palm of your hand. So the palm of your hand is actually formed by 5 bones. These are called metacarpals. So the metacarpals, there are 5 of them, form the palm of your hand. And then we have all these finger bones, and we're just going to call them phalanges. Phalanges. All right, so you should know that. Okay, we're almost done. Let's cover a little bit on the leg bones. So the bone of the thigh bone, which is actually the longest bone and strongest bone of the body, is the femur. And again, for those people who go on to take anatomy, you'll learn there's a femoral artery and a femoral vein and a femoral nerve and so on. The kneecap is known as the patella. The patella. And there are 2 bones in the lower leg, just like there were 2 bones in the lower arm, and they are called the tibia and the fibula. And here's how I'd like to help you with that. The tibia is the thick bone, and the fibula is the fine bone. So we have the thick tibia, right? Both start with the letter T, and the fine fibula. Right? So the tibia and fibula. And then in the ankle area, we have what are called the tarsal bones. So the tarsal bones are right down here. It reminds us of the carpal bones of the wrist, but these are called tarsal bones of the ankle. And then there are 5 bones that form the actual arch of the foot. And those are called metatarsals, reminds us of metacarpals that formed the palm of the hand. And then we just call the toes, the bones, the toe bones, phalanges, the same word we gave for the fingers. All right, so I've just covered V1, and that's to introduce you to the skeletal system. And so you're responsible for knowing these bones that we covered. It's not that many. That way, if you ever break a bone, has anybody broken a bone? All right, it's pretty common. In case you didn't know, it is common. And it's nice to know if they tell you your femur is broken or fractured, or you have a break in the metacarpal bones. It's nice, useful to know where that is. All right, exactly what's going on. So, and if you're going on to anatomy, this is just serves as a little bit of an introduction or assist in what is a very demanding course. Okay, so I've now covered that. The next thing I'd like to cover that you're responsible for is let's take a look at page U22. Now, section U is all about the PIGGIE, and I'm going to cover a number of things here, but let me begin on U22. So I'm not necessarily doing this in order, but on U22, let's tell you just a little bit about the nervous system, of a pig, or for that matter, a human. Now, we talk about, and I highlighted it, it's underlined and highlighted, what is the central nervous system? What we call the CNS, or central nervous system, is the brain and spinal cord. And then you'll notice that what we call the peripheral nervous system refers to all the nerves branching off the brain and spinal cord. But the main thing I'd like you to know is this term central nervous system. So in fact, I highlighted here, here's the brain, here's the spinal cord. That's collectively called the CNS, or central nervous system. If you look on the next page, U23, so let's just tell you 3 parts of the brain. Again, when somebody takes a course like an anatomy or physiology, for those people who plan to do that, you're going to learn a lot more. But anyhow, we're going to just tell you about 3 parts of the brain: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the medulla, or medulla oblongata. So the biggest part of the brain in a pig or a human is called the cerebrum. And then right behind it is the cerebellum, and then the lowest part of the brain is the medulla oblongata. You can see here's the cerebrum in this top view, the cerebellum, and the medulla oblongata is here. What are they for? So I simplified it right here. The cerebrum is for thinking. It is the part of our brain, the highest part of our brain, where we actually have awareness, or what's more properly called consciousness. So our conscious awareness, our ability to think and make decisions, and memory are occurring in the cerebrum. The cerebellum, that smaller brain area behind the cerebrum, we wrote is involved in unconscious coordination of complex movements. When we say unconscious, it means that we're not really aware of what it's doing. It operates subconsciously in the background of our mind. And it allows us to, as we wrote, run, dance, ride a bicycle, ski, play basketball, drive a car, even text message, where basically the coordination is controlled by the cerebellum. In other words, let's use the example of getting on a bicycle. When you get on a bicycle, now you had to learn how to ride a bicycle. But once you've learned, you just get on the bicycle and you just start pedaling, and you don't even think about it, do you? So since you're not consciously thinking about it, we might ask, then what part of my brain is controlling my feet to pedal and steering and balancing? Who's doing that, since I'm not really thinking about it? And the answer is your cerebellum. The same thing is true with swimming. You had to learn to swim, but once you've learned to swim, you just dive in the water and you don't really think about it. Your arms seem to know what to do, your legs kick the water, and you don't really think about it. So who's controlling the arms and leg movements and all that? Your cerebellum. And the same thing is true with driving a car. You had to learn to drive a car, but once you've learned, you kind of, how often does this happen? You get in the car and you're talking on your cell phone, which you're probably not supposed to do, but okay, talking on the cell phone, you're looking around while driving, and there's a sale going on at the mall, and you're maybe talking to the person behind you, you listen to the music, talking on the phone, maybe trying to text message. So who's controlling the car? It's the cerebellum. It basically goes into this autopilot mode. So it's involved in coordinating complex movements subconsciously. And then the lowest area of the brain is the medulla, or medulla oblongata. And it's vital for such very important functions, controlling our internal organs, including controlling blood pressure and breathing. So if there's damage, injury to your medulla oblongata, you're dead, because that's the part of the brain that controls breathing and controls blood pressure. Interestingly, though, if the lowest part of the brain is damaged, you die. Interestingly, if the cerebrum were damaged, you don't die, because this part of the brain is still controlling breathing and blood pressure. It's just that you no longer are conscious. We commonly say you're a human vegetable, right? So you have the same level of thinking as a vegetable does. In other words, you're not thinking anymore. There is no conscious thought. All right, so those are 3 parts of the brain. I'd like to next look on the next page, U24, and give you an introduction to the circulatory system. All right, so we're going to tell you a little bit about how blood flows through your body. An important subject for somebody who's completing a college-level biology course. So let me begin by saying that looking at the circulatory system, here's the heart. Now the heart is really made up of 2 pumps, a right pump and a left pump. Right pump and a left pump. And in the picture, this is the right pump and this is the left pump. And yeah, now you might say, wait a second, why is that the right and this is the left? You're looking at the heart as if you're looking at somebody facing you, like me. This is my right hand. I know it might be on your left side, but this is my right hand. So you're looking at this person's right pump here, and their left pump is over here. All right, so this is the right pump. Now each pump is made up of 2 chambers. And the upper chamber is called an atrium, and the lower chamber is called a ventricle. We're going to see this is all written down for you. So this is the RA, the right atrium, and this is the RV, which is not the recreational vehicle, but the right ventricle. Over here, this is LA, Los Angeles, no, the left atrium, and right below it, the left ventricle. Now, these terms are actually written on the next page, U25, just to see where they're written. So if you look on page U25, you will see underlined are the words right atrium, RA, right ventricle, RV, left ventricle, LV. So all the terms are there. Now another thing that I'd like to give you a definition of at the top of U25 is what is an artery and what is a vein. We want to know what an artery and a vein are. The definition of arteries is that arteries carry blood away from the heart. They carry blood away from the heart. That's the definition of an artery. Now it's easy to remember. Artery starts with what letter of the alphabet? A, and it carries blood away from the heart. Now if arteries carry blood away from the heart, veins carry blood towards the heart, to the heart. Now it is true that, so here, veins carry blood towards the heart. Now it is true that most arteries are high in oxygen and most veins are low in oxygen, but not always, not always. So this is the definition of an artery and a vein. Okay, with that in mind, let's look back at our previous page, U24, and see if we can explain some stuff. Now, Everything I'm saying is written on U25, so we'll just describe this, but you'll have this video. There are two huge veins in our body. One of them is called the superior vena cava, right here, and the other is called the inferior vena cava, right here. These are the two largest veins in our body. Superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. Now they are low in oxygen. I wrote the blood is low in oxygen in them. So typically on pictures, they would show these in blue. But the real reason why they're called veins is not because they're low in oxygen, although they are. It's because the blood is flowing to the heart. Anyhow, this blood low in oxygen is carried from the upper part of the body through the superior vena cava and from the lower part of the body through the inferior vena cava. Superior means upper part, inferior means lower. So that's where it's coming from. It comes to the right atrium. This blood low in oxygen goes into the right atrium, RA, and then down into the RV, the right ventricle. And then the right ventricle ejects the blood, and its job is to pump the blood through the lungs. Now, why would you want to send blood through the lungs? What are the lungs for? I know we haven't covered this, but I'm assuming some of you know what lungs are for. To oxygenate the blood, to gain oxygen and get rid of CO2. That's the purpose of your lungs. So this blood, low in oxygen, is going to go through the lungs and become oxygenated. Now the name of the blood vessel that is carrying the blood away from the heart to the lungs is called the pulmonary artery. Pulmonary means lungs. Arteries do what? They carry blood away from the heart. So the pulmonary artery is carrying blood away from the heart, that's why it's an artery, to the lungs. Remember though, this is a blood vessel low in oxygen. So in case you thought that all arteries are high in oxygen, you'd be wrong. Most arteries are high in oxygen, but that's not the definition of an artery. The definition of an artery is arteries carry blood away from the heart. The blood becomes oxygenated as it goes through the lungs, and then this blood flows through a pulmonary vein back to the heart, specifically to the left atrium. Now, this is blood high in oxygen. It's just gained oxygen and gotten rid of CO2, and it's flowing to the heart. You'd say, then why is it called a pulmonary vein? What's the definition of a vein? Carries blood to the heart. It's flowing to the heart, but it is high in oxygen. Now this oxygenated blood goes into the left atrium, down to the left ventricle, and the left ventricle powerfully ejects the blood out into the largest artery in the entire body called the aorta. The aorta, a huge artery. And there are literally 100 other smaller arteries that branch off the aorta to bring oxygenated blood to every part of your body. Let's just mention a few of them. One of the arteries that branches off the aorta is called the Carotid Artery, and it carries oxygenated blood to your head. Okay, so we'd like you to know the Carotid Artery as well. And another artery that branches off the aorta, we're going to call the Mesenteric Arteries. They are carrying oxygenated blood to our digestive tract. That's what it says right here, the digestive tract. Shows an intestine. Another artery that carries oxygenated blood that branches off the aorta is called the Renal Artery that carries oxygenated blood to the kidneys. The word renal means kidneys. And we'll just ask you to know those arteries. So you'll notice that going back up to the Carotid Artery, so the Carotid Artery is bringing oxygenated blood up to your head. Incidentally, just as a side note, if there was a blockage of blood flow, the flow of oxygenated blood in the Carotid Artery up to your head, which includes your brain, does anybody know what that's called if there's a blockage? A stroke. That's what a stroke is, a blockage of oxygenated blood to the brain. Okay, now the blood that comes back down from the brain through the jugular vein. Most of the time, the name of the veins correspond to the name of the arteries. This is one of the exceptions. It really should be called the carotid vein, but it is called the jugular vein. You've heard of the jugular vein because you've seen enough vampire movies. Because the vampires always bite into the neck and they draw blood from a jugular vein. That's the expression is going for the jugular. Incidentally, they're not really vampires. Okay, so the jugular vein brings blood low in oxygen down, and it connects to the superior vena cava, which returns us back to the heart. Now, we also said branching off the aorta were the mesenteric arteries, bringing oxygenated blood to your intestines and digestive tract in general. Now, as the blood flows through your digestive tract, if you're eating a meal, if you're digesting food, then at the same time that this oxygenated blood provides oxygen to your digestive organs, nutrients, sugars, amino acids, vitamins, and minerals are absorbed into the bloodstream, and they are carried by this blood vessel called the hepatic portal vein right to the liver. The word hepatic means liver. Have you ever heard the term hepatitis? All right, so hepatic means liver. So the hepatic portal vein, and it's called portal because it transports that blood high in sugars and amino acids and vitamins and minerals that have just been absorbed from your stomach and intestine to the liver. The liver is the biggest organ in your body, and that's where these nutrients are processed and stored. Your liver stores sugars as glycogen. Your liver stores amino acids as proteins. Your liver stores vitamins and minerals and all kinds of fats, including cholesterol. So it's a big storage depot among one of the major things that it does. So that's how these nutrients go right to the liver. The blood leaves the liver through a hepatic vein, which connects up with the inferior vena cava, which brings the blood back to the heart. Now, another artery we said that branched off the aorta are the renal arteries, again carrying oxygenated blood to the kidneys. Renal means kidney. And as the blood goes through the kidneys, it comes out through the renal vein. Does anybody know what the function of your kidneys are? Huh? Good, to filter the blood, to filter out or remove waste products out of the bloodstream. So, interestingly, while the renal artery is bringing oxygenated blood to the kidneys, and it comes out through the renal vein with less oxygen, interestingly, though, as the blood flows through the kidneys remove the waste products. So, in fact, the blood coming out of the kidneys and through the renal vein are actually lower in waste products than the blood going into the kidneys. So the waste products like ammonia and urea actually have been removed. So whatever ammonia and urea was in the blood going to the kidneys is removed, and so the blood coming out is cleaner, at least in terms of waste products. It has fewer waste products than the blood that entered. All right, and so this blood comes back low in oxygen through the inferior vena cava and superior vena cava, bringing blood from the lower and upper part of the body back to the right pump. The job of the right pump is to pump the blood through the lungs, or what's called the pulmonary circuit, and then this oxygenated blood goes to the left pump, and the function of the left pump is to pump oxygenated blood through all the organs of the body, what's called the systemic circuit, because it's all the organ systems of the body. You might say, did you write any of that? Yeah, right down here. At the bottom of U24, the heart consists of two pumps. A right pump that pumps blood through the lungs, that's called the pulmonary circuit, right, to get oxygen to the blood, and a left pump that pumps this oxygenated blood to all the other organ systems of the body. That's called the systemic circuit. So it's all there. And then everything else I said was actually on U25. Now, you might ask, well, how would you test this on the final? Well, we're going to have some questions on this, multiple choice. We're also going to have this diagram. Well, this diagram is this diagram. Now, I'm not asking you, in this case, I'm not asking you to label it, and memorize the word. There'll be a multiple choice question. Here's an example, right? It says the blood vessel labeled A is what? You'd say, where's A? Right here. So what the hell is that? That's the jugular vein up here, and down here, this is the superior vena cava. So again, I've given you the choices you can choose from down here, but we want you to understand how blood flows through your body. Now, I guess, if you don't think how blood flows through your body is important, then you can ignore that there. All right, so we have been talking about, so far, the skeletal system and the nervous system and now the circulatory system. Let's say a little bit about the reproductive systems for a moment. On page U18, so on U18, let's speak about the reproductive systems, and you'll be seeing these on the PIGGIE. In a guy, we'll start with a male. The reproductive organs of a guy are called the testes. And it's very possible that you covered the reproductive system either in your lecture class, if you took it a previous semester, or if you're taking a lecture now, it's very possible you covered the reproductive system, so there's a nice correspondence. So the testes are testicles. Now, what do the testes of a guy do? They're in these sacs below the penis. The name of the sacs are called the scrotum. The scrotum. The testes have two functions, and here we wrote them A and B. Letter A, the testes produce sperm, and the sperm can be ejaculated or ejected out the urethral canal of the penis. So that passageway through which the sperm come out of the penis is called the urethra or urethral canal. Incidentally, not only does sperm come out through that opening, so does urine. So both urine and sperm come out through the urethral canal. You'd say, did you write that? I wrote it right here. Now, a second function of the testes is to secrete the male sex hormone into the bloodstream. The testosterone is the male sex hormone. Like any other hormone, it is produced and released into the bloodstream. I want to emphasize, testosterone doesn't come out the penis. Right? Some people think testosterone comes out the penis. It's a hormone that circulates in the bloodstream, and that causes masculinization, which includes, among other things, growth of facial hair, deeper voice, increased muscle mass, faster metabolism, among other things. All right, so that's a guy, and we'll be seeing these structures to some extent on the PIGGIE. Let's look on page U19. And on U19, what about the female? Now, the reproductive organs of a female are called the ovaries. And attached to the ovaries are these fallopian tubes, and the fallopian tubes are then attached to the uterus or womb. Well, to help you understand that, let's look at U21. So in U21 is a picture of a human female reproductive system. So these are the ovaries right here. These are the fallopian tubes, and this is the uterus. And right here, down here, this is the vaginal or vaginal canal. Now, each month, the ovaries have two functions, just like the testes have two functions. The testes, we said, produce sperm. The ovaries produce eggs, or ova. And each month, typically one egg grows or develops in one of a woman's two ovaries. We believe the ovaries alternate. So that if 1 month an egg develops in her right ovary, the next month an egg develops in her left ovary, and then this egg pops out. And that, when it pops out, that happens to be called ovulation. That's the egg popping out. And it actually pops out, and it actually enters the fallopian tube. Now you might say, well, how does it get from here to here? Well, in fact, in reality, the fallopian tubes are attached to the ovaries. They weren't drawn that way in this picture, just so you could see the ovaries better, but they're really attached. So when the egg pops out, it's immediately in the fallopian tube. Now, the egg cannot move on its own, but the inside lining of the fallopian tube has cells with little hairs, or cilia, that move, that push that egg slowly but surely through the fallopian tube in the direction of the uterus. And it takes about a week for that egg to be pushed down the fallopian tube, and that's really the only time where a woman can get pregnant. A woman cannot get pregnant when the egg is still inside the ovaries. The sperm can't unite with an egg inside the ovary. It unites with the egg in the fallopian tube. The egg only lives about 5 days, and then it dies. So while it's being pushed through the fallopian tube, which takes about a week, the egg lives for about 5 days, and then it starts to die. So if the egg is fertilized in the fallopian tube, it will implant in the inner lining of the womb, or uterus, called the endometrium. Metrium means uterus, endo means inside, the inner part, and that's where the blood vessels grow in a woman, the endometrial lining of the uterus, to nourish any embryo that implants. Now, every month, if a woman ovulates an egg and the blood vessels grow, so you might ask, well, what happens if she didn't get pregnant? If she doesn't get pregnant, those blood vessels that grew in the endometrial lining are actually shed out the vaginal or vaginal canal, and that's called having a period or menstruating. And then the next cycle, the next month, the whole thing begins all over again. A new egg develops, a new egg is ovulated, and more blood vessels again grow in the endometrial lining.
What's endometriosis?
Let's not talk to me later, because I want to stay focused. There's so much to cover, and I'll be happy to explain it. And if you really want to know, you could take courses like anatomy and physiology, and then you'll learn all this stuff in more detail than you ever wanted to know. The outer layer of the uterus, the wall of the uterus, called the myometrium, and the Greek root myo means muscle. This is a muscular layer, a muscular wall that contracts. So you'd say, well, why would it need to contract? To push the baby out during childbirth. That's called labor contractions, and that involves contraction of the uterus. Now, all right, so we've just described the female. Now, here's your dirty picture for today. And some of you who have me for lecture have already seen this. This is intercourse. And some of us might be looking at this going, what? Okay, let me help you. This is a guy on top of a woman, and here's his penis inserted in the vaginal canal. You can see the sperm being ejaculated out the urethral canal of the penis, and they're released at the top of the vagina. And then these sperms swim from the top of the vagina up the uterus into the fallopian tube. And that's where, if there's an egg moving through that fallopian tube at the time that the sperm are released, where sexual intercourse is happening, those sperm can unite with that egg, and then you've got an embryo that's forming. So if there was an embryo that formed here, then it would implant in the endometrial lining. We wrote on page U22, on U22, that a second function of the ovaries, you'd say, well, what was the first function? The first function was to produce eggs. The second function of the ovaries is to secrete 2 sex hormones into the bloodstream. Now, guys only secrete 1 sex hormone. It's called testosterone. Women secrete 2 sex hormones. One's called estrogen, and the other is called progesterone. Estrogen is really the counterpart to testosterone in a guy. Estrogen is the feminizing hormone. It causes development of the female characteristics, just like including breast development and so on, is similar to how testosterone caused growth of muscles and facial hair and so on. But what's progesterone do? The root G-E-S-T in the word progesterone means pregnancy, and pro means to prepare. So literally, progesterone means to prepare for pregnancy. And that's the hormone that causes the growth of the blood vessels. That's the hormone that causes blood vessels to grow in the uterus and during pregnancy. So the purpose of that is to basically promote and prepare the body, a woman's body for pregnancy by causing blood vessels to grow in case there's an embryo that implants. Now, the ovaries, we wrote, unlike the testes, carry on these two functions, but only until about the age of 50. And at around age 50, the ovaries stop working. They stop producing eggs, they stop producing those sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone, and that's called menopause. Menopause is when there's a pausing, a stoppage of the whole menstrual cycle and reproductive function. So this is commonly referred to as the reproductive biological clock of women. And, I guess you could say one thing about it. It makes women more serious about life because they know there's a certain amount of time for things, and guys are kind of clueless, as we've talked about before, for a long, long time because they don't have that same way their body works. Okay, so we have now, in case you've walked in late, we have covered the skeletal system on page V1. We have spoken of some of the nervous system. We've covered the circulatory system, and we've just described a little bit about the reproductive system. So what I'd now like to do is let's go all the way back to the beginning on page U1. On page U1. So what I win. And on page U1 it says examination of the piggie. So I want to kind of give you an overview here, and then we're going to give you some time to look at the pig and look at the internal organs, and then I'll review anything you'd like, and then I'm going to just finish off the vertebrate animals. We'll finish off the vertebrate animals, and that'll finish everything off. Okay, on page U1, we do have these piggies we're going to be looking at. Here's a piggy. These are almost full, these are fetal pigs. And they're almost full term. They're pretty big. Now, where did we get them? How did they, where did they come from? For those people who eat pork, I don't eat pork, but for those people who do eat pork, when they slaughter the pigs, sometimes some of the females, the sows, are pregnant. And that happens. So when they slaughter them, so you can have bacon and pork chops, and this is true also, incidentally, with cows. The same thing is, but it happens to be, we're talking about pigs right now, not a calf. I don't have calves here. Right? But anyhow, so sometimes the females are pregnant when they're slaughtered. So they've never been born. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture, obviously, people eat beef, right? We have hamburger and steak, and they have lamb chops, and some people have pork chops and all that, and bacon. But the U.S. Department of Agriculture does not permit in this country the consumption of fetuses, of fetal animals. So they basically are just disposed of. So biologists, the cats are originally mostly feral cats, Are there a lot of loose animals, dogs and cats out there that, have run away? They're lost and they're picked up by what is it? The Humane Society or whatever it is. So anyhow, so they just dispose of the fetal pigs. So biologists said, those are like good examples of mammals, and the internal organs are really just like that of humans. Well, instead of just incinerating or disposing of them, why don't we use them? Because they're just going to be disposed of anyhow. So nobody has gone out to kill anything. It's basically just has to do with a byproduct of the fact that people eat food. So that's basically how we obtain them. So we're just looking at them, and they're a nice example of mammals. Now, there's some terms that we want you to introduce you to. And what is dorsal and ventral? Dorsal means the backside. You may have heard that term dorsal because if you see a shark coming right at you, it's got a dorsal fin that's cutting through the water right on its backside. Ventral means the bottom or belly side. Medial and lateral. Medial means towards the midline or middle of the body. Lateral means towards the sides. Superior and inferior. We have been using those terms for superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. Superior or anterior means from the top part of the body, the head end. Inferior or posterior means from the tail end, the hind end. And finally, pectoral and pelvic. Pectoral means shoulder, and pelvic, shoulder, chest. Pelvic means hip, like the pelvis. So we're going to use those terms. On page U2, so on page U2, so when you look at the feet of the pigs actually have toes. They have toes. They don't have a hoof. So the kind of biblical expression is they have what's called a cloven hoof or toes. A horse does not have a cloven hoof. It's a solid hoof. They don't have toes. All right, so you'll see the little pigs have toes. Anyhow, when you look at the belly side, you'll see that they have nipples, and they typically have 5 to 7 pairs of nipples. Now, it's very common for students who, when they see nipples, they say, oh, there's a female. Wait a second, hold on. Guys have nipples too. All right? Now, their nipples don't function, but they do have nipples. So the fact that you see a dog or a cat or a pig with nipples, that doesn't tell you if it's a male or female. So we'll tell you how you tell in a moment, but it's not based on nipples. The number of nipples, though, is interesting. Humans have 1 pair of nipples, 1 pair. And that indicates the number of babies that it usually gives birth to. Most of the time, humans give birth to 1 baby at a time. So it gets a pair of nipples to use for nourishment from the mother. So if the pig had 5 pairs of nipples, it means it usually gives birth to 5 babies at once. If it had 7 pairs of nipples, it gives birth to 7 babies at once. So you simply count the pairs of nipples, and that tells you the normal size of the litter. Now, obviously, sometimes you can have more, but obviously, sometimes in humans there's twins, but that's not common. Usually it's 1 baby at a time. So the number of pairs of nipples tells you the number of babies born at one time. On page U3, so on U3, here's a picture of the fetal piggie. And the fetal piggie is not only a good example of internal organs of a mammal, but it's got some unique characteristics of the fetus, including similar to the human fetus. Here's the umbilical cord. Inside the umbilical cord are 2 umbilical arteries and 1 umbilical vein. Now, we had said that arteries do what? What's the definition of an artery? Carries blood away from the heart. And same thing is true with the umbilical artery. The umbilical arteries, we wrote, are carrying blood away from the heart. And where's it going? It's going to the placenta of the mother, basically. It's going to the uterus of the mother. So the umbilical artery is actually carrying blood away from the baby, because arteries carry blood away. And this is blood. The blood you want to carry towards the uterus of the mother is blood high in carbon dioxide and waste products. So this is blood going to the mother, to the uterus, that is high in waste, high in carbon dioxide and waste products. So that's what the umbilical arteries do. carrying blood in the umbilical arteries to the uterus of the mother, high in carbon dioxide and waste. Now, there's one umbilical vein, and I really should have, even though this is arteries, I should have actually put this in blue, because this is blood actually low in oxygen and high in carbon dioxide. The umbilical vein is actually bringing blood from the mother, from the uterus, and it's high in oxygen and nutrients. We actually wrote all this down below. So the blood that you send to the mother is the blood that you want to basically get rid of the carbon dioxide and waste. And the blood, the veins carry blood where? To the heart. The blood is headed towards the heart, to the heart of the fetus, and this is blood high in oxygen and nutrients. So this is exactly what we wrote here when you read it. Now, how do you tell the male from the female? Well, first of all, obviously in an adult human or a pig, there'd be a penis and scrotum with the testes. In the female, the genital area of a human female is called the vulva. That word is written right here, the vulva. That refers to the genital area of the female. And there is a structure associated with the vulva area on the outside of a woman's body called the clitoris. And the clitoris really corresponds to the penis of a guy. It becomes erect during sexual arousal, just like the penis does. It's much smaller than the penis, and nothing comes out, unlike the penis where sperm or urine comes out. Nothing comes out of the clitoris, but it does become erect during sexual arousal. Now, in a fetal pig, it doesn't quite, they're fetuses. So not all these structures are fully formed yet. So if you look on the on U4 at the bottom, here's what you're going to see. On the male piggies, the fetal pigs, you're going to see these scrotal sacs. You will not see the penis. The penis is still actually internal, and it's not yet showing on the outside. So you don't see a penis. So if you're looking for it, you're not going to find it. But you will see the scrotal sacs with the testes in them. That's a male. The female, what they call the genital papilla, that corresponds to what in humans we call the clitoris. And you will see that. And remember, the general area, this general area is called the vulva. And that little structure that sticks out is called the clitoris. That's what we'll call it. So you don't have to know the word genital papilla, but we're going to call it clitoris. In pigs, they call it the genital papilla. Now, in the upper picture, this definitely looks like a pregnant woman. And so here's the fetus, here's the umbilical cord, and the umbilical cord is attached to the wall of the uterus. And where it's attached, where the umbilical cord is attached to the wall of the uterus is called the placenta. And we've just talked about what's inside the umbilical cord are 2 umbilical arteries and 1 umbilical vein. And so the umbilical arteries are carrying blood away from the baby's heart to the uterus of the mother. This is blood low in oxygen, high in carbon dioxide and waste. And then the umbilical vein brings the blood towards the baby's heart, the fetus's heart, and it's bringing blood high in oxygen and nutrients that it obtained from the mother's bloodstream across the placenta. There's actually 2 sacs surrounding the baby, 2 sacs. There's an inner amniotic sac and an outer chorionic sac, and I'm going to tell you more about that before we're done today. On page U5, this is where the mouth has been opened up of the pig, and when we look into the mouth, we see the roof of the mouth. And the roof of the mouth is called the palate. You have a palate. And the purpose of a palate is, it's more important than you might think. It separates your nose from your mouth. That's what the palate does, the roof of the mouth. So you'd say, why is that important? Why it's important is it allows you to breathe through your nose and have food in your mouth at the same time. So let me put it this way. Some babies are born with a cleft palate. You ever heard of that? A cleft palate means there's an opening in the roof of their mouth. So when they drink milk, it goes from their mouth right up into their nose, and they can't breathe. So they have to surgically correct a cleft palate. Fortunately, it can be done, but it's more serious than you might think. They got to fix that because every time they drink milk, it goes up into their nose and can't breathe. So that's the palate. Now the front part is hard. It's called the hard palate. The back part's called the soft palate. And then there's this little structure right there you'll see sticking out called the epiglottis. The epiglottis. We'll explain what that is in a moment. Let's say here I've underlined the terms pharynx means throat. I've underlined the words hard palate and soft palate and epiglottis. And let's just try to explain these things. Look on the next page, U6. So on U6, now even though this is shows a picture of a piggy, it could be a person, same idea. So here's, we know that normally air goes through our nose and food goes through our mouth. Now we can breathe through our mouth. And the air and the food go to our throat. What is the throat called? The pharynx. Now, coming off the throat, or pharynx, are two passageways. There's two passageways. There is something called the esophagus, which carries food to the stomach. And there's another passageway, another tube called the trachea that carries air to your lungs. So the food is simply going to go from the mouth to the pharynx, down the esophagus to the stomach. Incidentally, that's exactly the terms we used on the earthworm, you might remember. Now the air, whether you breathe through your nose or the mouth, the air actually has to go from the pharynx then through this thing called the larynx. What's the larynx? That's called your voice box. You can feel it. It's right here. Inside it is the vocal cords. So the air goes from your throat, which is called the pharynx, through the larynx, which is where your voice box, that's your voice box, your vocal cords, down through the trachea to your lungs. Now, here's the issue. We don't want food to go down, quote, the wrong pipe. Occasionally, we have eaten or drunk something very quickly, and a tiny little bit started to go down the wrong pipe, and you, the expression is, I guess it went down the wrong pipe, which it did. What normally prevents food or drink from going down the larynx and down into the trachea is this structure called the epiglottis. The epiglottis is a little flap that folds over to prevent the food from entering. So on the previous page, when we were pointing to this epiglottis, that's what the epiglottis is for, that we saw on page U5. That covers over the passageway to the larynx and prevents food normally from going down the wrong passageway. Now, let me just do one last one here for a moment. On U8, this shows that the abdomen has been opened up on the piggy, and this is the umbilical cord. And when you actually open up the abdomen, you can actually see this umbilical vein from the umbilical cord going right to the liver. It actually goes from the liver to the heart. Again, this is a unique structure found in a fetus. As an adult, we don't have an umbilical cord. We don't have umbilical arteries and veins. All of these umbilical blood vessels shrink in size after birth. So they formed, but then after we're born, we don't need them anymore. The umbilical vein, we said, is what's carrying oxygen and nutrients from the placenta to the liver and then to the heart. That's the umbilical vein. So you will see that.